Good morning. Can I please welcome members, invited guests and members of the public, particularly those watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Health Committee. Our main item of questions and answers with invited guests will be on the impact of green spaces in London. We encourage anyone taking part in the discussion on social media to use the hashtag Assembly Health and hashtag Green Spaces. First, we have a few items of formal business to go through before we get to the main discussions this morning. I have apologies for lateness from Assembly Member Umesh Desai and Assembly Member Joe Buckartney, who will be joining us later on. Can I also ask members to note the list of officers set out in item number 2 of the agenda, and also ask members if they have any interest to declare? Okay, thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions? Can I ask the committee to note the action taken by me as chair in the consultation with the deputy chairman, namely to give the committee's response to the Health and Care Vision for London? This brings us to the main item of discussion this morning, which is an answer and question session with invited guests on the impact of on the health impact of green spaces in London. So can I please welcome first Dr. Tom Coffey, the Mayoral Advisor on GLA, and I know that Tom, you have to leave by 11 o'clock. So hopefully we'll be done by then with you. Also, Andrew Jones from the Policy and Programme Manager of the GLA. Peter Massini, Principal Officer and Programme Officer at the GLA. Stefania, Horne, Head of Parks and Sports at London Borough of Hounslow. And Neil Sinden, London Director of Campaign to Protect the Rural England rather. And we're still expecting Helen Griffiths from the Chief Executive of the Fields and Trust. So before we start with the question and answer session, we have 2 short videos to watch from the campaign to protect rural England. So if we start with those videos, that'd be good.
Around 600 friends groups, parks friends groups in London, and I'm part of one in Hackney. Friends groups are absolutely key to getting the benefits out of parks for local communities, because they who often take a green space which is completely unused or underused and find ways to get the community using it.
We get volunteers coming from the local area, Penge, which is in the north of the London Borough of Bromley, quite a deprived social area. It's a very happy group of people really, and people develop different skills.
Hi, my name's Everall, and this is my dog Coochie. We come here. I like coming here because I can bring my dog with me, and I come here and I meet friends as well, and I do some gardening. So I like coming here.
So all the park friends groups in London are part of the London Friends of Green Spaces network, and I've also been helping with that network this year. And we were lucky enough this year to receive a lottery grant, and because of that we've been able to do some really great stuff. So we've been able to run lots of networking events where different friends groups have been able to share information and get ideas for things to do. But we've also managed to encourage friends groups to run events in the summer, and we managed to promote over 200 events in parks run by friends groups this summer, which was wonderful. And we've also managed to promote the work of friends groups more broadly, which has helped to bring just members of the public into their local park and become part of that community that helps with the management of the park.
We think it's really important to have networks of friends groups across London. We take part in the Greenwich Forums network. There's about 15 park groups that get together. And it's a great place to share ideas and experience. As a relatively new group for us, it's been inspirational.
There are major issues affecting London's parks at the moment, and there's also a huge amount of untapped potential and benefits that we could gain from London's parks that we're just not getting out of them at the moment for the local communities. So what we want to do is to support existing friends groups much more effectively, to help them share information and advice. And we also want to make sure that all parks in London have a friends group. There are still, believe it or not, 2,400 parks in London that don't have a friends group. And so we really want to change that and bring benefits to communities as a result. So to do that, we want to be able to get somebody on board who can help with bring some more capacity to the network and to spend more time developing the network and to really be able to take it to the next level.
There's one more with you.
Well, this was a green open space, valuable open space that had nothing on it or nothing happening. So we got a playground on the common. We raised funds and got the council on board and got planning permission. And since then, it's developed from there, and we have lots of planting. We have 4 events a year that we put on, and we've got the fountain working, and we've got a table tennis table. Lots of people have become involved in the group, Stoke Newton Common Users Group, and it's building all the time. Now this space is used by loads of people. It's really well used space.
Great. Thank you for those. Tom, we'll start off with questions with you. Could you briefly outline how green spaces are beneficial to the health and the well-being of Londoners?
Okay, so, first of all, thanks for inviting me here, and I'm very much in a listen and learn mode, as well as kind of trying to, explain, as I perceive, the benefits for the green space in London, because I recognise that I would hope at the end of this process you'll be developing a report which you will be submitting, and some recommendations for the Mayor for us to kind of go further in what we are already doing on green spaces. And Sadiq's got an approach very much of health in all policies. So also to say, it isn't just about what we do in health, it's transport, environment, planning. And I think that's what I'm going to be pretty extending into, is out of my natural health area into other areas. So in advance of this meeting, I asked colleagues within our department to do some detailed research, right? I was counting the references we're up to, which was 54, which I will share with you and your colleagues about, where is the evidence? And so therefore, I would divide it up into physical benefits, mental health benefits, and benefits kind of very much around air pollution and the environment. So for the physical benefits, what we would identify them very much in cardiovascular and diabetes and childhood obesity. So what we're very much aware of, and this is from a meta-analysis of green space exposure and health outcomes in environmental research published in 2018 by Bennett and Jones. And they were very much looking at childhood obesity and its direct correlation to the access to green space. And that's probably linked as much to the ability to exercise. So the closer you are to a green space, the more likely you are to exercise, and take the daily recommendations, the less likely you are to be obese. And also what we know, there is an inverse correlation almost between poverty and distance from your green space. And the more likely, the poorer you are, the older you are, the more likely to have long-term conditions, the harder you're going to have to access green space. Then for adults, again, it's very much on cardiovascular health and on type 2 diabetes. For cardiovascular health, again, the link is very much to proxy measures of cardiovascular disease, which we would go down to blood pressure and cholesterol measurements and level of exercise, and their direct impact on improved cardiovascular health. Again, the link to type 2 diabetes, we feel, again, is access to encouraging exercise. The other area regarding mental health is very much about looking at adult and children. So the evidence that we've got regarding for children is that this is linked to both children's mental health, adults' mental health, and also noise pollution, which is something which I wasn't necessarily aware of. So for children's mental health, again, what we're aware of is access, and it's not just to green space, it's to well-kept green space. What we know is that it reduces the stress in children, it improves mental well-being, and also there is a direct link to cognitive development. So a child which is closer to a green space and uses that green space is likely to have improved cognitive development. And also there's a belief that it has an impact on ADHD diagnosis. So the closer you are to green space, the more likely you are to use that well-preserved green space, the less likely you will to get neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, for adults, the evidence looking at the benefits of green space with adult mental health is linked around depression and sleep improvement and mental health well-being. And there's a much greater link in adults than to children to the impact of green space and its ability to reduce local ambient noise. Because what we're aware of is noise pollution in adults as opposed to children has a negative impact on adults' mental health. If you can reduce noise pollution, you both reduce depression and improve sleep. And we know both those two things will improve health outcome. And again, with my health inequality hat on, when we look at what are the causes of health inequality, especially in mental health, access to green space could be one of those which you could indicate as a problem whereby poorer access, poorer mental health, and poorer access in people, again, as I said, who are lower income, elderly, long-term conditions, and black and ethnic minority groups. Air pollution. What we're aware of for air pollution is that the poorest parts of London have the poorest air pollution. And we know that air pollution has a link to cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease, and there's growing evidence as well linking it potentially to dementia. So what we're also aware of is green space has two impacts on air pollution. One is as a barrier, and so therefore if you're able to put your trees and your green infrastructure in such a way you can actually make that act as a barrier between pollution and where people are playing and active. Secondly, the green infrastructure does have a mechanism to remove air pollution from the environment. So therefore you can use your green infrastructure to have a double effect on the reduction in air pollution. And again, as I've said earlier, access to green space, more difficult for certain groups. And again, if we don't get it right, we are potentially worsening air quality and inequality. There is also the health economic modelling. And my understanding there is an economic model process. When you look at what are the benefits of putting in green space on the health and economy, and that is the physical health and mental health. And again, very clearly, these have to be well-kept green spaces which are used by people. And the pound that you spent on maintaining and investing into your green spaces as a £27 benefit in London accordingly. So the research that I've asked colleagues and myself to look at and to distill would identify not only the benefits of green space to improving health, but also making sure there's fair and equitable access to green space. Thirdly, that green space is looked after and preserved, otherwise it will not be used, and to make sure it's as close as possible to where people live. And I think one of the figures that I've seen is regarding the distance people want to have to access the green space around 400 metres, and whereby again there is a health inequality trend in the distance from green space and the poverty of the person in their house. But that's the evidence that we've looked at so far. And I think it's overwhelming to say green space, access improves health, and there is a health inequality divide at present in London to access to that environment.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that very comprehensive answer. Of course, Public Health England sees green spaces as a wider determinant of health, as it asks areas to measure the proportion of people who have access to natural environment for health benefits. We realise that the relationship is not directly causal, but is there a correlation between the boroughs with the lowest number of green spaces and health outcomes of residents?
So if you make the assumption that the evidence that I've seen of the meta-analysis of all the studies indicating access to green space would improve your health outcomes, mental and physical health, and that if you take this as the only determining factor, all else being equal, if you have two boroughs, one with large amounts of green space, which is accessible and well kept, a one without that, I would conclude, therefore, the borough with more green space would have improved air quality and would have adults and children with improved physical and mental health.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I think you may have alluded to this already, but just for the sake of completeness, are there some socio-economic groups more disadvantaged than others by the lack of green spaces?
That there definitely are. So, and the groups that I looked at, or that were looked at by my colleagues, so the one I would easily identify would be the children, and families of low income. But also, the evidence show that if you've got a long-term condition, i.e. you've already got poor physical or mental health, you're also more likely to have poorer access, both geographically in distance or just ability to access it. Secondly, also black and ethnic minority communities in the areas of London where their population is of a greater percentage, their access to green space at present would seem to be lower. Mm. So there is definite gradients of access to green space. And when I keep talking about well-preserved green space, because the figures that we've seen is that London is a green city, right? 47% of London is green, that is, and also green, kind of blue, rivers and green. But only 18% of it is classified as public open space. So there's large chunks of London which we don't classify as kind of as open spaces, and there are areas of deficiency to public open space. And so we recognise there are boroughs, whereby there is adequate levels of open space, which is there and can be used. Now, I'm very much aware that the mayor has limited powers, to kind of over green space. He's got the ability to kind of make sure that he can support infrastructure. He can can try to put in London planning laws to protect and incentivise and support boroughs. But the National Trust, the local authorities, Thames Water have got the greater control over the provision, and upkeep. And I think we'd be very much aware that the austerity measures which all local authorities are facing, might have an impact on their ability to continue to, upkeep of the green spaces.
Great. And a review of the inequalities in access to green spaces by Public Health England noted that some minority ethnic groups in poor residents of cities, older people and disabled people were less likely to visit their local green spaces. How can the public authorities deal with the inequalities of usage of these spaces and as well as access?
Okay, so I think what we can do, and I think, and I'm thinking what it perhaps has already been started as well, is to make sure that so accessibility, it has got a number of kind of parts to it. First of all, it's geography. How close is it? So if something is more than 400 metres and you're a frail elderly person, it is more difficult to get there. So you want to make sure you have got access to green spaces. It doesn't have to be enormous kind of parks like Richmond Park. You can get what's called pocket parks. You can make sure that in your planning you ensure that you've got the appropriate kind of pocket parks and green spaces in all new developments. Secondly, you want to make sure that the parks are they're accessible to the degree they're well lit, they're well maintained, and they feel safe and secure. A park like that is more likely to be visited than a park without those characteristics. What Sadiq has already started is establishing the London Green Space Commission, and then colleagues of mine in the environmental group will probably know more detail about that, is how do we encourage boroughs to have more green spaces? So you can have a planning regulations to make sure all our kind of planning ensures there's green spaces in our new developments. But how can you make sure that existing places are well kept? And so the London Green Spaces Commission and the London and the Green Infrastructure kind of funds can assist that. And I'm very much aware that I've got a whole list of projects that we've supported in a GLA to increase access and improve facilities. The one which I will only mention because is the new swimming pool lake at Beckenham Place Park. Because when I met Sadiq, he was very excited having visited it and gone to its opening. The idea is that we can very much increase and improve our access, but it means that we've got to do all we can in the GLA. But principally, we also need to make sure we give the support to the local authority, the Thames Water, to the National Trust to maintain and improve their spaces.
One of the things, of course, Tom, of course, what you say is absolutely right, but also it's about the facilities that are available. I mean, I come from London Borough, particularly part of Southall, and the residents complain to me regularly that they have no toilets in the parks. The elderly need to use the washroom very quickly, or the young people. And when boroughs ride or councils have stopped those facilities ride, it reduces accessibility to those parks. People don't go to those parks because they don't know when they can reach the toilet in time.
Yeah. And I think that is a key point, is having a green space in itself is probably insufficient. You've got to make sure that it's safe and it's got facilities which encourage its use. And I will know from where I live in southwest London, in Wandsworth, there are many parks who are very well kind of kept, and you go there and they're well lit at night time. They have got, as you say, either a cafe or a toilet, and that will encourage use. Just having a green space in itself, will sometimes not be enough to improve accessibility. Yeah. But when the evidence. And this is where we have more joined up thinking, whereby I'm aware, from the evidence, to say that £1 of investment by a local authority in the upkeep of a park can have a benefit to the health service of £27. However, because they're different budgets, the incentive for the local authority to do something to benefit health isn't always clear and apparent. So I'm very aware for local authorities with their very, very tight budgets, will be concerned to make sure they use that money wisely, and they may wish to get investment from their wider health partners because the benefits are to the health of Londoners, and therefore they may feel there should be a genuine contribution accordingly.
Okay. Mr. do you want to comment at this particular point? No? Okay, fine. Okay. The other thing is that there are many indirect ways in which some groups lose out on these spaces. But there are direct ways too. I'm thinking of these developments we have had the misfortune to see in London, where residents in affordable homes are blocked from communal gardens. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, we are seeing huge density of growth of flats and accommodation, and I think all London boroughs, particularly I'm very conscious of this in London Borough, in a particular place called Southall. We're building houses, and houses. But there's lack of access to open spaces, right? I mean, is that a concern to you also, Tom?
So all I would say is that I would wish to have London open to all Londoners, and secondly, if you're building new spaces or providing new spaces which are green spaces, which we know would have a health benefit, and there are people in that vicinity who would benefit from that new area, I would want, wherever possible, to encourage that accessibility. I'm aware that, and I think what you're describing is housing developments, which are very much gated communities, whereby the access to the often the central courtyard is only for those people who live within that gated community. I would always hope that facility would look at its wider community and see how can they make sure that they also benefit from the provision of that new green space.
Yes. We'll come to that other question. Maybe this is better at Andrew. City parks are often taken up with events, right, like music festivals, which disturb the residents, and block areas of the park which can damage the terrain. But yet these events are much needed for revenue for councils. Is the right balance being struck between the access and revenue settings of these things? And is there anything the City Hall can do to standardise an approach taken right across London?
Do you This is probably an area where my level of knowledge is insufficient to give you a kind of a detailed answer. I mean, aside from a green space isn't just for dog walking, right? Or playing football. A green space. So you want to encourage all parts of London society to use these green spaces. So be it a music festival or a sports event, that ensures that people will visit a place. And what I'm very much aware of is that once you get someone going to a place once, albeit for a music festival, they're more likely to go back again for another recreational activity, be it sports, just walking or whatever. So therefore I can see the benefits of having a music festival as a gateway to those people returning to that facility and improving their mental and physical health. So from a health perspective purely, having activities in a green space which encourages the use by people who wouldn't normally there, I can see the benefits. The debate regarding the damage to the ground and the revenue loss from a local authority is probably beyond my level of knowledge.
Thank you for that, Tom. Andrew?
Thank you. You've answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask, actually. But one of the things I'd like to interrogate you a little on are the pros and cons of having having a few large parks or many small green spaces. You talked about your enthusiasm for appropriate pocket parks and that green spaces should be in most new developments. What do you think the value is of the different sizes of those green spaces?
So I was touched watching a video of how looking at the size of the parks that were being used were actually quite small, and the spaces to encourage people to get out was maybe a hectare kind of space. Because in London at the moment we are building homes for Londoners. A lot of these are flats, and these are quite dense developments, and my sense is that you want to make sure you've got a green space there, and it's unlikely that you're going to get a space, a new space in London which will provide a large park. Now I've got some sizes here, but I'm sure you're aware of it as well, of a definition of size. So a pocket park is under 0.4 of a hectare. So, and that's the kind of size which I would imagine one could fit into a housing development, whilst a district park is let's say 20 acres, or definition of a local park 2 hectares. And I suppose my comment would be is that you've got to match your green space to the available size, but to use every opportunity. If we had a view is that a green space is only worth putting in if it's greater than 2 hectares, I think you might then minimise the opportunity to increase that space. And especially, as most of these flats will not have gardens, there'll be, quite dense populations. And so I think the benefit of pocket parks and small open spaces are of great value to those new residents.
You talked about the health-related benefits, and I can understand the health-related benefits of walking around a park, exercise and that kind of thing. Is there anything else about a park that contributes to good health?
I would probably kind of talk more about the mental health benefits, and I think that it's very easy to see the 7 o'clock morning joggers going round, and there's a very clear correlation between exercise, weight, and cardiovascular health. But the growing...
I mean, that's kind of established.
But the benefit is, I would say, the thing I would go more is the mental health benefits. And what I was surprised at was the improved cognitive development of children, the reduction in ADHD, and the reduction in noise by having green space and its impact on depression and sleep. And it's not just vague ideas of mental well-being, but it literally, improves sleep quality, depression, neurodevelopmental disorders and cognitive development in children. So I would see those benefits, but they're the ones where the evidence that I've looked at has shown me the benefits. Colleagues, probably more expert than me, may have a wider array of health benefits.
Perhaps later on we'll ask them about the, sort of the benefits to relatively passive people of green spaces.
Yeah.
So, if you go and sit on the park bench,
Yeah.
is that good for you?
And I won't repeat my answer necessarily. So therefore, apart from the mental well-being is the air pollution. So we know that if you're sitting in a park, the air quality is better, right? And again, because of the barrier impact and the green space and vegetation absolutely extracting from the air pollutants.
Has there been any quantification of the economic benefits of parks on health?
There has.
You've talked about there are benefits, so I just wondered.
So if I just therefore the health economic model. So there's what's called the ONS natural capital account, and that's done nationally, and it looks at UK urban green space. That's been applied in London, and so the figures here. Each year, green spaces save £580 million by contributing to the better physical health, and £370 million by contributing to better mental health. And so that they are the economic benefits, derived from the National Capital Account for London. And again, for each £1 spent by local authorities and their partners on public green spaces, Londoners enjoy at least £27 in value. So there's the benefit from the green spaces, and the investment further in the maintenance of those green spaces give £27 to every £1 spent.
Thank you. Do you think that bodies like the NHS are making sufficient usage of their estates in terms of providing green spaces, bearing in mind that there's such obvious benefits to the health of the country?
The answer is I don't know, but I suppose taking your question further, should they and could they? The answer is probably yes. I'm always surprised whereby, so first of all, there are a lot of NHS hospitals are trying to use their land to the maximum benefit of their health service. And so what you are finding is that hospitals will be either building on the excess land or selling off surplus land to raise capital to improve NHS facilities. But I am aware of, as an example, Springfield Hospital in southwest London, which is a very large estate, which in fact is selling off a lot of its land, but is making sure that the reprovision of housing and green space on the land which has been sold off is in line with sufficient green space. The other link which I haven't mentioned about the NHS and green space is social prescribing. So social prescribing is now I think very much starting to become embedded in general practice. Patients sees a GP. Many patients require an input which isn't about a medicine, an operation, or anything medical. And a lot of social prescribing is about making sure people have organised walks in green spaces, access to green spaces, because often it is literally the first step that is required of the person to go and visit a green space they may not have gone because of safety concerns, mobility concerns, or access concerns. So almost every single social prescribing project in London has an arm of it which you can refer into exercise classes which aren't in a gym but are often also based in the green spaces in their vicinity.
Back gardens are a green space as well.
Sorry?
Back gardens are a green
Yep.
space as well, but not obviously publicly accessible. Do you see what value there is in back gardens to the health of Londoners?
So first of all, any provision of green space has the benefit of air pollution wherever it is. Secondly, there are some areas whereby encouraging private residents to open up their gardens to other local residents who haven't got access to their gardens, often to grow flowers and vegetables, whereby you've got a community And also this is quite a good project, not just about making sure those gardens are well looked after, but actually bringing the community together. So I know where I'm in Tooting, there is a project whereby people are encouraged to open up their gardens to neighbours, especially the older resident who isn't as good at maintaining their garden, to have a younger person who might, help them with their garden. I know we've got allotments around London, but allotments, can be quite hard to access as well. And it's another way of, I think, of community integration and using that green space.
Isn't the encouragement from there with regard to back gardens is that people should build on them?
Sorry, I don't understand the question, sorry.
Well, the Mayor's removed protections from back gardens from the London plan.
Yeah, so that's probably an area which I'm not familiar with, but all I can say is that for those who have got a back garden, the ability to open it up to other Londoners, I think perhaps should be encouraged.
That's a great suggestion if they're still there by the time they can make that decision or being sold off for more flats. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. That's quite a nice introduction to my piece, which is about threats to green spaces. And I look forward to hearing from some colleagues who have been waiting very patiently the last 40 minutes to contribute to the conversation. So, first of all, we've heard about a very potential threat to green spaces, which is a threat in the London plan to back gardens. Let's take an extension to, I'm sure colleagues want to comment on that, but let's take a further extension, perhaps starting with Neil at CPRE, and I'll declare my interest. I'm a member of CPRE, so let's get that on the record. Could colleagues outline what they see as the main threats? We've heard all the good things and the benefits and to be commended. What are the threats? Perhaps we can open it up to colleagues.
Shall I kick off?
Please do.
Thanks very much. I think what I'd like to say really is that I think there are threats on all levels to green spaces of all kinds within London. The way we look at it is we've got a large area of countryside around London, much of it designated as green belt. 7% of the metropolitan green belt is within London, and it constitutes something like 20% of London's overall area. And I know we've been focusing on parks largely, public parks so far this morning, but we would think there's huge value in public access to greenbelt, countryside, farmed landscapes, woodland landscapes, as well as to urban parks. And we are concerned still that despite some very strong provisions in the draft London plan and some very effective action, I think, by the Mayor over recent years, that Greenbelt and indeed metropolitan open land, which is the equivalent of Greenbelt within inner London, is still being lost to development. The statistics aren't entirely clear, but I think over the last, up until 2015, the previous 10 years, something like between 100 and 200 hectares of green belt were lost, and we still see threats happening since then on an annual basis. Indeed, there are current threats in places like the London Borough of Hounslow, where the local plan is proposing to delete about over 100 hectares of green belt from the designated area of greenbelt within Hounslow. That's just one example of many. Metropolitan open land, which arguably has a greater importance for people in inner London, 10% of London is metropolitan open land, still subject to significant threats from school development and other related development, including one only recently approved by the Secretary of State for the Environment in Harrow last week, where we're going to see the loss of a large area of metropolitan open land. In terms of threats to the scale, that's sort of where we start. In terms of threats to the quality of green space within London, they are many and multifaceted. And we've heard the emphasis that Dr. Tom Coffey has placed on the quality and the importance of well-kept green spaces and the importance of dealing with noise pollution and air pollution. But you'll be aware that of data published a few weeks ago which shows that a quarter of all London's parks are damaged by serious air pollution, and work that we did a year or so ago, which needs to be updated, on the traffic noise affecting London's parks, revealed that a third of London's parks are severely affected by traffic noise. So there are some serious issues there around the quality of green space, and as we know, as we've already heard, the impact of austerity is affecting local authority budgets in terms of managing and maintaining planting and so on and so forth in green spaces in across London. So there are some serious threats, I think, that need to be addressed if we're going to get the maximum benefit for health outcomes from green spaces that London still enjoys.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, we must be aware and underline the threat to the green spaces, be they back gardens, be they green belt, be they metropolitan open land. I know boroughs, and we get onto the boroughs in a minute. One of my boroughs is doing a whole review of its green spaces. And of course, inherent in the review is a review that perhaps they may develop on them. And that's driven by housing targets. So I'd thank you very much for that. And it's very timely because I'd commend the publication only yesterday, I believe, of the APPG CPRE in London Greenbelt Council of a positive vision for London Greenbelt, which covers many of the issues around health, although we're not just talking about Greenbelt today. Which leads me on to parks and the boroughs. Helen, your organisation is very much supporting parkland for recreation use. Do you want to talk about the threats that your organisation is facing?
Sure. So Fields and Trust is a UK-wide charity, and we protect parks and green spaces in perpetuity to try and ward against exactly some of the threats that we're talking about this morning, and precisely because of the benefits we know that they generate. So we are very concerned about the ongoing threats to parks and green spaces as a non-statutory function at the point that we have such significant pressures, both in terms of austerity, as you've already mentioned, and those other drivers that we know have a big impact on the loss of parks and green spaces, particularly the need for housing. And there's never any more pressing need for housing than in the capital. So the work that we do is to try and identify ways that we can both champion the value of those parks and green spaces so that we can bundle up all of the things that we've been talking about today to think about why we want to be able to kind of preserve them against those threats. So from our perspective, we think very much about publicly accessible parks and green spaces. So the kind of typologies that we're interested in is not quite as wide-ranging as colleagues, but we are very interested in how those spaces can benefit the communities that they serve. And we know that there are 17,000 hectares of publicly accessible parks and green spaces in London, and only 6% of those parks are legally protected. So whilst I'm not saying that they are vulnerable or identified as an immediate threat right today, we know that the position is that they could potentially be lost to development in the future because of all those pressures. So we work very collaboratively with a whole range of London boroughs to try and protect spaces, and what we're seeing is a trend towards a more kind of holistic review of that green space, which is really positive. So we are working with some boroughs at the moment to try and look at a much more wholesale protection across the portfolio rather than looking at the protection of an individual park or green space.
So you're seeing boroughs, I mentioned a review of one of my boroughs, which I think is largely driven by where can they potentially put legitimately housing on certain green spaces. You're saying that this might be some of your reviews you're involved in could be quite positive around protections.
Absolutely. So we're working with Haringey, we're working with Hammersmith and Fulham, and looking at portfolio-wide protection programmes to cover a very large number of the parks and green spaces that they are currently responsible for, which I think is a move to try and mitigate the potential loss that we know could happen as people are looking at the provision of the space and how their park strategies can really start fitting into some of these wider conversations. And I think, as Dr. Coffey said, that need for that joined up thinking to be able to establish the value of these spaces is so very important. Without being able to quantify what the value of those spaces are, it can be very difficult to create the business case to defend against the threat to that space when we're faced with these very challenging times. And I think that that's the work that we are undertaking, both in terms of our own organisation, but also with the Parks Action Group through MHCLG, which came out of the Select Committee Inquiry into Parks in 2016. Okay. And that kind of driving that sort of cross-departmental, joined-up thinking approach across all these agencies that gain significantly from the benefits that parks and green spaces create is really important. I think one thing that is also really important from our point of view, just to go back to a previous point, is that inequity of provision and where we see that certain demographics are going to be disproportionately affected by loss of parks and green spaces. Yeah, I think we've got some questions around that a little bit later, because what I'll be interested in is also teasing out what further protections, and I'll get on to Stefania in a moment, because it's all very well reviewing and saying these are valued green spaces, but what we want to hear in a minute and working along is what sort of protection available. We've heard about green belt
protection, metropolitan open land. I think there's a new green spaces classification. So, I mean, I'll pass it over to Stefania about, so you're in charge of the parks and sport in Hounslow, and you might have planning and housing colleagues wanting to build on them. How are you getting on with that conversation?
Thank you, Chair. So thank you for the opportunity today. I'll go straight to that point in terms of the challenges the local authority faces in terms of different competitive needs, effectively. So there are some, obviously, we all agree from a local authority perspective of the value of green spaces, and particularly also linking to the video that was aired initially, the value of communities building around green spaces and how green spaces are catalysts to actually strengthen communities and obviously as a result also increase health and well-being. Yeah. So in terms of competitive, different priorities, in Hounslow, like in London, housing targets has increased dramatically. We've got constant pressures on obviously tackling that, and also obviously as been mentioned before in terms of budgets, local authority has been crippled really in terms of budgets. So just to give you an idea in terms of industry, the parks industry, total budgets UK-wide used to be £900 million and now it's about £600 million.
This will encourage you both, you and Helen both, to encourage friends groups, I presume, because
absolutely,
there's an economical logic there, isn't there?
Absolutely. And they are, and we in Hounslow actually, together with a lot of other local authority, we are working collaboratively with friends groups. And actually to a point that we are actually co-design initiatives and making sure they are right on the driving seats together with us to make decisions about the parks and open spaces and what we do with it. And in terms of also the challenges that we face, you might be aware the select committee from the inquiries findings were that local authority were best placed to look after parks and open spaces, and yet we're facing a huge reduction on budgets to look after those parks and open spaces. We've been very inventive as local authorities and very creative about how do we work together in collaboration with other groups, about organisations and also initiatives to increase these budgets. Just to give you an example, obviously we're in Hounslow, and I know the local authorities as well, they're working very closely with public health authorities in order to strengthen initiatives linked to social prescribing and work with friends to activate parks and open spaces. And there are two elements in terms of funding parks and open spaces. One is the infrastructure and the accessibility and the overall maintenance, which is kind of business as usual, if you like. And the other one is activation. And the activation of parks and open spaces is absolutely crucial to target the right people, to target the right communities, to make sure that the use of the parks is maximised for its value for those communities. Okay. Right. So there are different pressures on those budgets, infrastructure budgets and activation budgets. And for activation budgets, I think we are working now and developing even more collaborations with colleagues in public health to make sure that these initiatives are very much continued and supported. But public health as well, in general, their budgets has been slashed as well and it's been reduced. So to give you an example, in Hounslow, and I know the boroughs as well, the public health helped us to increase accessibility, looking at the parks as green infrastructure, creating new footpaths and new green links, as well as activation activities like our parks, yoga and everything else, all the activities that there. But that budget has decreased over time. So obviously, I think what we need to do is we need to work together to make sure that this framework with Public Health England and Public Health is kind of strengthened, and some of the activation initiatives are actually embedded in the management of parks and open spaces.
So that's strengthening the core purpose. I mean, it occurred to me, Chair, that there are other serious, people like City of London are very large landowners, a green belt and are custodians and responsible custodians. So it's important we consider when we do our work, that there are other key people. So on the same theme, moving along, and Peter and Andrew have been waiting very patiently, moving along the theme of threats to Greenbelt, which largely is around, we've heard about budgets, but not Greenbelt, but green spaces, sorry, which is largely around pressure on housing. How is, do you recognise that, Peter and Andrew? What is the Mayor doing to protect the green spaces that are clearly have the health benefits that Tom's talked about? Peter.
So you're aware the London Plan's just gone through a whole process
Indeed.
of review and examination in public. And if we look at Greenbelt, the Mayor's planning policy was to protect the Greenbelt. That's actually been pushed back by the government inspector. The government inspector is saying that that should actually be slightly weakened to be in line with national planning policy framework.
He is independent, the inspector.
Sorry?
He is an independent inspector, but I take the point.
Government appointed.
Cross-party, the chair of the planning committee has written accordingly to register our dislike of that.
Yeah.
Okay, but good point though.
And similarly with the open space policy, the open space policy is there to protect the core network of public open spaces, which has been a long-standing policy in the London Plan, and I think has been reasonably effective over many years. Despite the increasing pressure on development in London, and we are still a very green city compared to many other cities. So it has been a pretty effective policy. But clearly, the London Plan is there to try and balance the need between protecting open space and providing the housing and transport infrastructure that London needs.
Well, I want to pick up on Andrew's challenge to Tom, because Tom didn't really recognise the benefits of private gardens for the people who live there. You talk about opening up the private gardens, and often in very dense populated areas, the only green spaces are perhaps that small garden in flats and whatever. And indeed, the challenge here is it appears that the fact is the London Plan has taken away protection around these back gardens. Peter?
It's not actually taken away protection of back gardens, because there was never formal protection of back gardens in the London Plan. There was a provision in the previous London Plan which allowed local authorities, where it was appropriate and where there was community support, for protection of certain back gardens. There's never been blanket protection of back gardens.
Right.
The new small sites policy will allow some development in potentially some back gardens, but only if it's replaced by equivalent amount of green cover. So it hasn't changed significantly since the previous London Plan.
I'll let the planning expert, for Andrew, take that on in his own guidance.
He's the planning expert.
And I'll just lastly for me, Andrew, from the environmental point of view, again, what is the Mayor doing proactively in your field to protect and encourage green spaces in London?
So, I mean, just building on what Pete said, obviously we've got the London Plan, but I mean, the other policies in the London Plan to promote greening of buildings. So there's the urban greening factor. So there's a requirement in the new London Plan that that new development should provide more greening than it previously did. So it's not that balance of just protection. It's about encouraging more greening within the built environment.
Okay. I'm just hearing in my own head that the government proposals, or whatever government it may be, that you've got net environmental gain or net natural capital gain. Does that figure in the Mayor's plans?
So there's the net biodiversity gain, which the government is considering as a statutory provision in the Environment Bill, and that's reflected in the London Plan. That should be biodiversity net gain where appropriate.
Yeah. So when there's a development in London that potentially builds over green spaces, the Mayor would only agree, if referred to him, if there's a net biodiversity gain.
So in terms of net biodiversity gain is about looking at what's already on the existing site.
Yeah,
so 0 to 0 is 0. Yeah. So obviously it's proposing a 10% increase over the existing base.
Right, okay.
I think we think the urban greening factor provides a provision that will provide that net gain for biodiversity. But obviously you've got to remember that green infrastructure is not just about the biodiversity benefits it provides a lot of other benefits in terms of flood alleviation, cooling, etc. So the urban greening factor will put a requirement on nearly every development to provide additional greening, which we haven't had in the past, unless it's been mitigation for what's already been there.
I think that'll do for me, Chair.
Good. Thank you. Umesh?
Chair, may I make a final comment before I leave?
Yes.
I
said it, John.
Yeah, so it was only answering Mr. O'Connell's comment about, what is the Mayor doing about protecting green spaces? And so I asked the group that I work with, say, give me some concrete examples, pardon the pun. So there is a Greener City Fund, and so £8 million having been spent and awarded, and so 10 new community orchards, 3 new woodlands, 29 school air quality greening projects, 29 community gardens, 13 projects to improve local parks. The list kind of goes on, and so these are kind of small projects, I accept. But I think it's just demonstrating a commitment that the Mayor has made, not just to protecting, but improving and increasing green space. And he believes very clearly in health and all policies. He is persuaded of the benefits of green space in health, and therefore will do what he can to improve green space and improve the health of Londoners. So, and I hope that demonstrates, his commitment in this field. Thank you.
I realize you've got to leave at 11, so I've got about 2 minutes to get in one question. I was going to ask you about the Greener City Fund, but you already covered that. I don't think you covered the area around the Mayor's work on social prescribing. How does it support better use of green spaces for health purposes?
Okay, so there's 3 steps of social prescribing. Person often sees the GP, like myself or like Onka, and then we recognise there is a need which isn't a direct health need, and we send them off to a navigator. That navigator has a local knowledge of the local system, and often their need is about increasing activity. So the benefit of increasing activity, irrespective of green space, is enormous for physical and mental health. But often that person, hasn't got the ability to access that activity, needs a person to go with them, to give them support, hasn't got the motivation. So ensuring that we have got a green infrastructure that the local navigator, having received a social prescribed patient, can take them to, can show them to. So therefore, the actual improvements in green space means that when I do a social prescription, I've got a degree of confidence that that person who I know needs to walk and exercise more has got a place to go and do that. Going into a gym isn't always the right answer. Doing exercise outside and walking outside has, much more benefits. One thing Mr. Boff asked me, I should have mentioned vitamin D. The benefits of being outside, and increasing your vitamin D levels because of sun exposure and improvement of muscle and bone health is enormous. So exercising, I'm a fan, I don't go to gyms much. I exercise outside because I'm aware of there are greater benefits exercising outside than indoors, and social prescribing can open that up to many people who just aren't used to or able to access that activity previously.
You want to carry on with your questions?
I'll come in later on. Or do
you come in now?
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
I think 2 of my questions seem to have been covered, but if I can just ask all of you really, what assurances can you give that the health impact of these green space initiatives is being assessed, given that healthy places is a core commitment in the health inequality strategy?
I can probably answer that. So we're working with Camden and Islington on a project at the moment which is funded by the Future Parks Accelerator. It's a funding programme from National Trust, Heritage Lottery Fund and MHCLG, funding a 2-year pilot of parks in Camden and Islington, looking at how that park network can be planned and managed to deliver health outcomes. So built into that programme is actually a long-term assessment of, if you change the way parks are planned and designed and managed, do you actually provide specific health outcomes? So being a 2-year project, that actually gives you a reasonable amount of time to make that full assessment of the health benefits of a different approach to managing parks.
I mean, also just to add to that, in terms of the Greener City Fund that Tom mentioned, that's got various strands of funding to support tree planting, improvement of large green spaces, establishment of small green spaces, improvement of small green spaces. And we've had various strands over various years. For example, that the strand that's currently being implemented to support community green spaces, 35% of those are in areas of deficiency in access to nature and 22 in areas of deficiency in access to local open space. So they are in those areas of deprivation where there are limited opportunities for more limited opportunities for people to get out and access green space. So those funds are being targeted to some extent to support those who are in most need.
I can also add, in terms of a local authority perspective, you know, we do measure the impact of all the activations and the activities that we do in our parks and open spaces, and the figures, it really speaks by themselves. So, for example, we do have 17,000 hours, volunteer hours, in our parks and open spaces every year. 6,000 children involved in outdoor education, 1,000 park runners every week, 900 users that uses our parks facilities, like, for example, yoga classes, and these are all like linked to social prescribing and walk to health as well. So 1,000 people as well linked to that program, and 5,752 residents engaged with 1 year, which is linked to the NHS and the activities that we did together. And 73% of these participants showed improvements in physical activity levels and health and well-being. So we do measure the impact of the activities we do have, and shows clearly a very good impact for the targeted communities.
Looked at the local authority perspective, because I think I also worked in Redbridge before, so I'm quite familiar with some of the work, because it's a neighbouring borough. I mean, unless you have anything else to add, Helen and O'Neill, I'll...
Just one thing, and it's not so much on the metrics, but just to emphasise, I mean, in my initial comments were focusing on following the question, focusing on the threats to green spaces in London. I think what the videos that we were involved in producing showed at the beginning of this session was the huge potential that there is to actually enhance the benefits that existing green spaces can provide communities, and particularly focusing on the critical role that friends groups, community-based friends groups can play in sort of like adding value to the work that local authorities do, but in terms of just outreach into communities to provide opportunities for people to enjoy those green spaces in new and different ways. So there's vast potential. You know, there are, by some estimates, something like 3,000 parks in London. We know that there are something like 600 friends groups. So there are lots of parks without friends groups, and lots of friends groups which actually aren't strong enough really to do as much as we would like to see them do to promote community engagement in local green spaces. We're doing some work that is funded by City Bridge Trust over the next 3 years, working with partners, including the London Friends of Green Spaces network, to provide a platform to promote the benefits of parks and to promote the work that friends groups do. It's called Go Parks London. There's a website there that's being developed, and we really want to do all we can to use that site and to provide a sort of a window into the activities that friends groups are encouraging and supporting in local green spaces, and to encourage more people to get involved, more friends groups to be established, more local authorities to support their friends groups at a borough level.
So just picking up that point about friends groups, I mean, they do an excellent job, there's no doubt about that, but they struggle from the same lack of diversity as many other voluntary groups. So what can the Mayor do to widen participation in organised activities around parks?
I think that's a really good question, and I think that sort of underlying the discussion we were having earlier about lack of access for certain communities to green space is not just issues to do with proximity and where, you know, particular parts of London lack access to either public open space or green spaces, but it's also about how do you provide opportunities for, you know, excluded, disadvantaged groups to actually make better use of green space on their doorstep and more widely. We're very supportive of things like the initiative in Tower Hamlets that I'm aware of, where in the Bartlett Park in Poplar, the Mayor of Tower
Which
Hamlets, Bartlett,
yeah.
in Poplar, where the Mayor of Tower Hamlets has supported the provision of a complete redesign and improvement of an existing green space and an expansion, but using community engagement to ensure that the design of that green space and the play facilities in that green space are properly inclusive of all parts of the community, including particularly young children with physical disabilities and special needs. And that's a really interesting case study, which I think needs to be looked at and replicated in other parts of London to actually widen access to green spaces to people that wouldn't easily find it possible to access green spaces in the first place. We are also working, for example, with refugee groups in other parts of London to see if we can provide, if you like, a stepping stone for those groups to engage with local green spaces next to the service centres that they're getting advice from through community gardening initiatives and so on. So I think widening access in terms of being more inclusive, encouraging more inclusive use of green spaces is really about targeting measures in particular locations to give communities the confidence to make use of local green spaces and hopefully therefore to grow the benefits that they get from them.
Right. Well,
Sorry, can I just add something to that? And I think on that point, it's understanding what the motivations for use of those spaces are by some of those particular groups. So some research that we conducted demonstrated a set of outcomes that we could see that different groups obviously value and use parks and green spaces in very different ways. And some of those things are, kind of expected in that if you are an urban resident and you don't have a back garden, then your park or green space becomes very much a home from home. It becomes a place where you do interact both with the wider community. It becomes a space for that sort of community cohesion and interaction point. And we know that there is a huge amount of activity around where parks and green spaces sit into the loneliness strategy and how it sits within other kind of civil society pieces. So it is that home away from home point. But we also saw that the BAME respondents in our survey were far more likely to use parks and green spaces as a place to engage in team sports and engage in other kind of pursuits within the local community. And that was kind of quite counterintuitive to some of the other research that we were aware of that said that, okay, we're looking at harder to reach groups here. We're looking at communities that we don't feel are accessing, or participating in physical activity. And actually what our research demonstrated to us was that actually in many instances they are, but just not within a recognised structure that is currently being quantified and accounted for. So it is the jumpers for goalposts piece. It's local leagues that are taking place in the community that is not being quantified by Sport England and other bodies where we're looking at how much physical activity is taking place. And so I think having that informal access, which is so important about parks and green spaces, is really important. And we also saw that the respondents in the research that we conducted had very different value points on parks and green spaces. So we undertook a willingness to pay study around parks and green spaces. So if you were to no longer have access to a park or green space, what's that worth to you? So non-market good, value in non-market good approach. And the willingness to pay values were significantly different in lower socioeconomic groups and in BAME communities after we'd adjusted and gone for welfare weighting. So that showed us that both BAME communities and lower socioeconomic groups value parks and green spaces more than double other groups in that respondents. And therefore, if those spaces are taken away, and we've already talked about how we know that access is lower in those areas, then we are seeing a very disproportionate effect on those people who value and use those spaces the most in many different ways.
So I'm glad you made that point because I actually live opposite a park, and apart from the council festivals, it's hardly used. I mean, you get people jogging around in the morning and so on, but essentially the park is just a way for people crossing from one part of my ward to the high street. And I would say that at the park, your park should be the hub for local activities, schools, community groups, and so on. And it's a concept that I think does need developing. So yeah, the Bartlett Park. I mean, I'll get some evidence. I'll get in touch with Diamonds Council, but it's something you can send to us.
It's not quite complete yet, but I think it's due to open, if not later this year, early next year.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just one quick comment. That point about some parks don't seem to be that well used. And something we've been promoting in recent years is this concept of green infrastructure, thinking about that network of parks and the public realm in between as a network of spaces. So it's not just thinking about the physical space of the park, it's thinking about the connections to the park, what other functions that park can have. So there's lots of projects recently where parks which were predominantly designed back in the 1950s and 1960s as large areas of grass playing fields have now been, their management has been changed to create areas of wildflower meadow or more natural play areas to target those groups who wouldn't normally use the park. So we need to think much more holistically about the use of space in general. And I think the key thing about the health issue is that it's not just about access to green space, it's about the health benefits of a greener urban environment. And actually some of the key people who have the most significant health issues, whether it's elderly and infirm people or very young children, are actually less likely to go to a park. If you're a 2-year-old, you're not going to go to the park unless you're going with your parents. If you're in your 80s or 90s and you're physically infirm, you need to have greenery on your doorstep. So things like the Healthy Streets Initiative, which is about how you change the nature of public realm, remove traffic, create living streets, is equally as important for particular groups with the most serious health issues than physical access to a park.
Be a bit parochial here.
Sorry, just 2 further points I wanted to add to that as well, also about the Greener City Fund, the community grant strands. We provide the framework, and those are very much driven by the community in terms of them designing the projects for what they need, and in terms of a local level. They're very much that framework we provide. So there are clear examples coming through in terms of specific health projects. I can run off a couple. The Free Outdoor Education Centre in Lewisham is working with attendees of the Growing Lives programme for people suffering mental ill health. There's a Core Landscapes project working with Homerton Hospital, Tower Hamlets, and enabling people to do more horticulture and help with their mental illness. The other thing I think, and Tom mentioned, was about how you activate spaces and what the Mayor's doing to help activate spaces to get people out there. This summer we had the National Park City Festival as part of, and that's over 90,000 Londoners attended 317 free events, and some of the stats we got from that were festival introduced people to new outdoor spaces. Over a third were visiting the spaces where the event was taking place for the first time, and just over half of those indicated they would come back again. So it's that type of activity that is trying to get new people out to go and use those spaces who wouldn't normally use them.
Sorry, I'm sorry to be a bit parochial, Chair, but the Thames Barrier Park, do you know much about it? Because that's the Thames Barrier Park in Newham.
I don't know anything specifically.
Very underused, of the GLS space. Sorry.
So you say it's not very well used. So what was your question?
Thames Barrier.
The Thames Barrier Park.
Yeah.
Which is GLS space.
It's the one space that, for historical circumstances, the GLA owns and manages for strange historical reasons. Yeah,
I know I get frequent complaints from the local residents, but there you are. But that's great park space, but very underused.
Yeah, I think that's partly because of its location. I mean, it was built as part of the barrier, and long before that area is not yet gone through a regeneration program. I think as the regeneration of that area occurs, that space will be better used. It's just a bit distant from many people at the moment.
Well, I just use an example because regeneration has already taken place. I mean, the developments and the communities that have sprung up around, but from what I see, there's not much usage of the park, so perhaps there.
That development has just had a bunch of dormitory flats thrown at it. The Mayor wants to build more of them. So what can you do?
I mean, I'm just on that point. I think that kind of the regeneration can bring in opportunities to revitalise parks. And I do know in Newham, there is a new initiative, a system-wide initiative looking at the park system within Newham to see how they can actually generate more engagement and activity within their parks. And I think we have to accept, as we heard earlier on, austerity has actually had a massive impact on the ability of boroughs in relatively poor areas like Newham to manage their parks effectively. There are small pocket parks that have, up until 10-15 years ago, had good investment in them or managed well, where they've just become almost no-go areas for contractors that are responsible for maintaining those areas on a kind of shoestring budget over recent years. So, you know, there's a real opportunity, I think, with regeneration generally, to begin to look at how you can get a more diverse group of individuals involved in animating and making much better use and improving green spaces.
Okay. As well, there is another research that is well used in public health in terms of behaviour change, which is called EAST, which is easy, social, attractive and timely. And what it means that, you know, I think locally it's important to identify the key communities that we need to reach out to, and then create opportunities for these people to actually know the parks and understanding what they can do in the park and open spaces. So that's been widely applied, and we're applying in Hounslow. We apply that kind of function. We just recently designed the new welcome sign with that in mind, using silhouettes and also linking to give the idea what the park is about, but also linking to the wider infrastructure for TfL in terms of legible London, and so looking at the parks as infrastructure in relation to that community, and see how we can then link to that with activities that we do in the park. So we've done that through treasure hunts and exploring the parks together with the new communities, and a lot of people didn't know that park existed, and they said, actually, it's great, I'm coming back. So I think there is lots out there, and linking to the National Park City as well. We do a lot with linking with the National Park City to engage communities and increase outreach.
So talking about London being a national park city, the Mayor wants London to be a national park city, and this is to you, Peter and Andrew, meaning half of land in the city would be green space, but there's a risk focusing on a top-line number would undermine work to make sure that our green spaces are made as good for Londoners' health as possible. So how can the Mayor make sure that all these aspirations are balanced?
So the aspiration to make more than half of London green is a recognition that as London grows, and it is growing, we need to make sure that that growth doesn't result in the gradual loss of green space. And so the London Plan policy framework is reasonably good at protecting core green space. But we know that as new developments come on stream, and they are relatively dense developments, we need to incorporate greenery into those developments. This goes back to my earlier point about, for many people, their access to green space is actually the green space on their doorstep. So new developments, including things like roof gardens, green streets, sustainable drainage, actually creates a greener neighbourhood that provides those health benefits for those who can't physically access parks. So it's a point that Neil said, the regeneration process in and of itself, if it's done well, and with the policy framework provided by the Urban Greening Factor, can actually result in greener neighbourhoods, despite the fact that actually maybe denser neighbourhoods, they can become greener neighbourhoods too, because you're liberating streets from traffic and turn them into greener public realm. And that's going to be quite a critical implementation going forward as London grows.
I think I'm not to add to that.
Right. One more question. I might come back to your point, the point you just made, because I'm trying to think of how this translates in terms of the health benefits. So you can have greening of developments, and you've given some examples, but I'm just trying to look at how do you quantify the health benefits?
Funny enough, I was actually reading this morning a piece of research that's been done it's largely been done in America, but looking at how do you actually maximise the benefits of greening. And that research showed that having greening within developments, having green streets, having more tree canopy in streets is equally important as creating and maintaining parks, because of those groups of people who don't access parks, who can't access parks. And they're often the most vulnerable groups, those with the most significant health problems. So you need to have that greenery, immediately within and around the places they live and work and places they go to school. So it's not just about protecting parks, it's actually about greening the urban environment, and that has quite considerable health benefits. I can send you the reference to that study.
So this brings me to the last question. So you've got something called the urban greening factor, which awards a reasonably high rating to green roofs and walls, according to my briefing, scoring them 0.8 and 0.6 out of 1 respectively. By comparison, the top score of 1 is awarded to wildflower meadows and 0 is given to paved spaces. So is this scoring a useful representation of the health representation of, say, green walls and roofs?
So the urban green factor has been introduced to try to encourage the greening of the built environment, which has those benefits in terms of not just health, but in terms of climate change. So the urban greening factor uses those scores. They're a proxy. They're largely related to resilience issues, how you actually make the urban environment resilient to the impacts of climate change. And it's a system that's being used in Seattle, in Berlin, in a number of cities around the world. The urban greening factor, say, is largely focused around how you green urban environments to provide climate change benefits, but they also have health benefits because you're creating that greener urban environment. So they're not direct.
Has any correlation been done between the greening factor and health benefits? Is there a link with it, and has that link been established?
Well, there's a link been established with making greener environments. As I mentioned earlier, that piece of research has been done in the States quite recently, saying that if you green urban environments, you have significant health benefits as a consequence. And clearly the urban greening factor is driving those greener developments, largely from a climate change resilience perspective, but it equally has health benefits.
I mean, in simple terms, that if you're developing that greening for climate change benefits as your primary purpose, it still can provide a home for wildlife. So you might end up with your blackbird living there, which people can then sit down and listen to when they're in their green environment and gain the sort of the mental well-being benefits from that. So you've got to look at it in terms of what it's a co-benefits that are being delivered through that urban greening factor, in terms of even if it's a green roof that you might not automatically perceive to deliver a health benefit.
Good. Before I hand over to my colleague. Yes, sir.
I've got a green roof on my house. I've never been there. It's lichen, and in terms of the health benefits, as much as it might do some good for cleaning the air, health benefits, none whatsoever. Never set foot on it.
You're taking one particular roof.
No, it just occurred to me, and the point is
but you
that
feel better though if you're doing your bits.
But not in the least. It's put there just as part of the development. But when you made your reference earlier to replacing back gardens, and you're saying that there should be if somebody builds in the back garden, you should replace the green cover. But that's the kind of green cover you could replace it with, isn't it?
It could be.
It could be. Thank you for that.
But so the planning system is trying to balance this issue between more housing and green space.
But that critical mass of green roofs will provide homes for wildlife, and that wildlife will live within that green environment. And there is evidence about association with wildlife being good for mental health, and there's strong evidence about that. And that association can be very small.
The other thing, we talked about the Green City Fund, right? Has any assessment been done of the benefits of those in terms of health benefits of the Green City Fund?
No formal assessment. As I said, we've supported a number of projects which are directly delivering health projects in hospitals and designed around a scheme that is focused on people suffering from mental and health issues, but we've not done a formalised assessment in terms of what the proportion of health benefits.
Because if you did this assessment, you may prove that they've been useless, or they may prove very, very helpful, right? And it's worth repeating them.
Yeah. I mean, I think as we go back, the evidence of having a greener environment by default provides opportunities for access.
The assumption is that they're always helpful.
There will be some, and it'll vary between the schemes.
Yes, good. Okay. Jill?
Yeah, I'll ask some questions, starting with protections for our green spaces. Are the legal protections sufficient at the moment? And following on to that, do the protections perhaps have some unintended consequences. And I'm thinking back to when I was first elected as a local councillor, an area of metropolitan open land, which was really just scrubland beyond houses with one very small access point, and was just used for dog walking. But trying to get some investment there was absolutely uproar to improve it and whatever. So are the legal protections sufficient? And other than any unintended consequences about being able to actually do some investment that would benefit a greater number of people? I don't know who wants to go first.
I think the first thing is the difference between the planning protections and legal protections, because the Fields and Trust, some of the work they do is about providing legal protections to green space. The London Plan largely provides planning protection, which is not doesn't mean that those spaces are sacrosanct from development. It just means that you need to make sure that their benefits are properly weighed up in terms of future proposals. I'm not sure that those planning policies have unintended consequences in terms of preventing better management and investment in those spaces. The legal protections might sometimes do that because it sometimes, and I'm sure Helen will explain better, sometimes the legal protections constrain and makes it less flexible in terms of what can be done with that space.
So Helen, do you want to tell me about some difficulties?
Sure. So from our perspective, because obviously the planning protections that are in place do not necessarily mean that those spaces are sacrosanct. So as an organisation, what we have done for a very long time is to have a slightly different intervention, which is to legally protect in perpetuity an identifiable park or green space. And so that's achieved via a legal contract called a deed of dedication that we sign in conjunction with the landowners. So primarily our stakeholders are local authorities. I mentioned earlier we're working with some across the board, but we have legally protected spaces in 27 of the London boroughs at the moment, and about 161 sites in total that are protected via that mechanism. The reason that we think that is so important is because of those changes. So, as we can look at the plan as it stands now, we can look at what it looked like in 1963. We can imagine what it might look like in 2025. And what we want to try and do is ensure that there is a core provision of legally protected parks and green spaces that are sacrosanct, that we know cannot be developed because there is this contract in place that ensures that they're protected for future generations because of all the benefits we know that they bring. So to think about, so obviously we have, as I said, engagement with 27 of the London boroughs, and we have a reasonable number of protections across that, across the whole of those boroughs. But we would, of course, like to see more, because that does mean that there are large areas of the capital where we don't have any sites that we've permanently protected, and we'd like to see more people living within a reasonable distance of a protected space, so that we know that in the future those communities have got guaranteed access to those spaces. I think if we think about for a minute the question about whether or not that creates enough flexibility for those spaces, I think that's a really good point, and it's something that for us as an organisation we've battled with particularly over the past 10 years, because we don't want to be seen as an organisation that is trying to in any way kind of fossilise land. That's absolutely not our purpose. What we want to be able to do is ensure that there are safeguards in place to ensure that people have access to good quality recreation, and what that might look like now and what that might look like in the future can be very different, and so it's not our intention to be prescriptive. We do not get involved in ownership or management. We want to see those protected spaces used in the best way that they can be for those communities. So that if that means the installation of wheeled activities, if that means changes to the way that those parks are laid out and provided for, if that means the addition of ancillary facilities, all those things are very much within what we want to see happen to those spaces, because our aim is to make sure that they are protected. So we think it's very important that we continue to drive for a certain level of permanently protected spaces, and that's the work that we're trying to do as part of the green infrastructure standards that are being developed by DEFRA as part of the 25-year environment plan. So to work to embed both in terms of future developments, which are obviously incredibly important, but without forgetting the existing spaces. And obviously it's slightly more difficult to retrofit that piece to see how can we make sure that there is a level of protection of a reasonable standard of parks and green spaces for people to access, and we're doing that in parallel with looking at how we can see a sort of a minimum standard of quality as well. And obviously a lot of that is driven through the Green Flag Award process. So how do you manage ensuring that there is both quality, quantity and access to those spaces? And for us then that green infrastructure standards piece is incredibly important. But as we try and drive both of those things forward, we're incredibly conscious that working with colleagues at local authorities, it's an incredibly challenging position, because they are in a very difficult situation in terms of those different drivers around budget and resource. I mean, we've had a programme, very small scale, but a programme that we were funded by the London Marathon Charitable Trust to deliver over the past 2 years, where we've been trying to give improvement grants, or activation grants as they're called, to individual parks and green spaces. And there are a number of London boroughs that we have not been able to engage with, who have not been interested in us giving them a sum of money to do some activation, to then be potentially eligible for a larger activation pot, because they just don't have the resource in-house to be able to to handle that. And I think that's probably our biggest challenge at the moment, is not that there isn't a will within the executive to be able to see those spaces being protected, but there just is such a lack of resource for non-statutory function.
I don't know whether Stefania wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I do. So thank you. I do definitely echo all those comments in terms of the challenges we have. And we do have a number of parks in Hounslow that are protected with the fields and trusts. And I feel that that's a really useful tool in terms of making sure that, we do have opportunities from now and in the future to make sure that parks and open space develops in line with the needs of the communities. We do have these challenges in terms of resources all the time, and that's why at the beginning I said about I think in terms of frameworks and in terms of what we do and work together with colleagues, not only in public health but also, for example, with Transport for London and the transport team, to make sure that all the links as well between parks and open spaces are clearly mapped and used and maximised. And I feel that this kind of frameworks needs to be strengthened, because as Helen mentioned, we are still a non-statutory service, and we're not saying that perhaps we need to the solution is to become statutory, but perhaps through the statutory channels there's got to be some ways of perhaps and frameworks to harness those resources that can help us to maintain and develop parks and open spaces.
Okay, and I want to just look at some of the tensions there are in our parks and open spaces. And we talked a little bit about the demand for land, for housing, for employment space, which all go towards determinants of good health. But quite often, when decisions are taken, communities feel as if they're very much left out of the process in those choices. So I'm just wondering, how can communities make their way through this process? And is there any examples where it's been done really well, where there's been development but actually improved provision of green space or improved quality of green space, with the community being really at the heart of that?
So you mean in terms of design or in terms of...
I think of both, but particularly if we look at some of the big developments that are on, I suppose, ex-brownfield land, for example. Is there good examples where new housing has been built, employment spaces are built, but actually the community has been at the heart of designing that area and making sure that green space has been a major factor?
If I can chip in there,
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to think of any specific examples, but we have been running a programme of activity which we call Space to Build, where we've been working with community groups in certain parts of London, notably Enfield, where we've actually reviewed developed space within Enfield and looked at and identified particular areas which could actually benefit from redevelopment and regeneration and reinvestment. And we're continuing to work with groups in Enfield and indeed the local authority to see if we can help bring some of those sites forward and encourage their regeneration rather than building on greenbelt, because we coming back to the planning protections, we feel very strongly that greenbelt and metropolitan overland should be sacrosanct. There should be no development on either of those categories of land, and yet we are still losing tens of hectares a year of such land to development pressures, and that needn't be the case, because there is space to build in many parts of London, But there are barriers that have meant that local authorities haven't been able to bring forward those sites, identify them, put them in plans created by the broader national planning policy framework. So we're working both locally and indeed nationally to influence national government to adopt a much more rigorous and supportive approach to using brownfield first. And where we can, we will work with communities as we've done in Enfield to make that a reality on the ground in London.
Yeah, I've met the local group there about that, yeah.
So, just perhaps some examples of where regeneration has resulted in enhanced green space, and with a reasonable amount of community involvement. There's two examples I can think of. Is Kidbrooke Village in Greenwich, which is the old Ferrier estate, which was a really run down and poorly maintained estate. And that's now a pretty good example of how you can incorporate green infrastructure and new green space into a new development. And similarly, Woodbury Down in Hackney, again, where the development has also been an opportunity to catalyse the opening up of Stoke reservoirs to public access. I can't guarantee that those two projects have had sufficient community involvement, but there's a project we're currently working with on the moment in Thamesmead with Peabody. So the GLA and Peabody and other partners were successful in getting funding, the European funding project, a 5-year project called Clever Cities, which is specifically looking about how you do co-design with communities as part of an urban regeneration project to deliver green infrastructure. So the whole project, the whole 5-year project, is about co-design with communities. So communities are actively involved in designing the new green spaces, the new public realm within that development, and trying to find new and innovative ways of doing co-design, using quite innovative digital technologies to engage far more people in that process.
Can I ask, do you think public bodies are sufficiently good at opening up their own green spaces? For example, local authorities, hospitals, St Guy's at the back of the building, the other side of London Bridge Station, actually invites people into its grounds to sit under the trees and enjoy the facilities that they have. But could we do a lot more?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it actually is about those spaces have always been part of the sort of informal public realm, but people didn't know they were there. And a lot of those landowners didn't actively encourage people to into those spaces. I think now with, particularly with the acute awareness of problems with air pollution, and it's something I do whenever I walk from City Hall to Union Street. I take the back roads, and cause one, it reduces your exposure to air pollution, but also you find places you didn't know existed. And many RSLs, housing associations, now recognising that the green space around those housing estates are informal public realm green space and can be designed and managed to allow for walking routes through those spaces. And again, it's something we're trying to work with Peabody at Thamesmead to make sure that Peabody-owned estate is not just for the residents, but actually for the wider community, because there's a significant amount of green space within the estate that can be made more accessible to the wider community. So I think there's lots of opportunities to think about how we move through the public realm and make use of those incidental green spaces throughout the public realm.
Is the GLA, either your planning team, doing any work on encouraging public bodies in particular, or housing associations, to open up their spaces, perhaps providing a toolkit or guidance on how they could go about it?
Yeah, so we're working with and supporting various organisations that actually we've been doing a project with through the London Natural Park City initiative with an organisation called Tranquil City, which is using digital mapping to identify the more tranquil spaces in the city and then turn that into an app so people can actually use it to find their way through the city. So a lot of our work is to support those innovative, interesting sort of startups who are trying to think of different ways of people using space within the city and giving people the information to make their own decisions about how they better use the public realm.
Could I just chip in there? I mean, I think this brings us back to the comments that were being made earlier about the importance of connectedness and a network of not just green spaces, but public spaces that are attractive for people to use and be in. So we're also working with Tranquil City, trying to apply some of the lessons that CPRE learnt when we did a national exercise mapping what we call rural tranquility, over 10 years ago, where we came up with a map showing relative tranquility across England between some of our national parks, for example, some of our less well-known countryside and some urban areas. Obviously in London, on that national scale, the extent of relative tranquility within London was extremely limited. But we want to look at how, but nonetheless the map of London that we produced at that time did have some variations within it, where there were some relatively more tranquil parts of London than elsewhere. And we think that there will be great merit in doing that exercise again, but actually adopting a scale which is more relevant to the urban context of London. So we've been talking to Tranquil City and others about how we can do that, how we can identify using some of the technology that they've developed, the less and more tranquil parts of the city, and use that data to actually develop a new network of walking routes, we call green walking routes, that would connect, no doubt, existing green spaces, but actually improve the links between those spaces so that people can have easy access from their doorstep to a green walking route, which takes them to a local pocket park, and then which takes them to a regional park, and then beyond to the wider countryside in the green belt and into the wider countryside and the kind of protected areas that surround London, such as the South Wales National Park or the Cotswolds or the Chilterns or the Surrey Hills areas of outstanding natural beauty. So there's a great opportunity, I think, to rethink the way in which we move around London in ways that can actually improve health. And I think one example of work that we haven't mentioned so far that the GLA are doing is in relation to the Public London Charter, which the Mayor has committed to, which is, I think, contained as a commitment in the draft London plan. So we've been working with the team here who are developing that charter, which is focused on relatively small areas at the moment, areas that have generally been newly regenerated, which are privately owned, but which public access is allowed in, to encourage higher standards in the way in which the public are allowed to use and experience and move through those spaces. So we're looking forward to that charter being produced next year, but we hope it will be a platform or a springboard to a broader debate about how we can make London's wider, if you like, public environment more accessible and attractive and healthy for people.
And just to add, as I think I mentioned earlier, through the Greener City Fund, there's a project going on in the Royal London Hospital in terms of trying to improve the quality of that, and the current round of the Community Green Spaces Grant, which the application is closed last month. We're currently assessing the projects, and there are a number from hospitals and surgeries looking to do some enhancements. So, and I think that's more than we've had previously. So there's some support going into it, open up those spaces and make them better quality.
And my last question is, we've touched on this a little earlier, but obviously councils are cash strapped. With growing population, there is a need for parks to be multi-use, if you like, and so many more are hiring out the land for concerts. So, for example, I know you talked about noise earlier on, and one of my local parks, Finsbury Park, plays host to some major music festivals, particularly during the summer, and residents from a few miles around complain about the noise, but the local authorities say, well, actually, we need the revenue so that we can invest in the parks for the future and maintain it. Do you get the sense that London councils have the right balance at the moment, and would there be a role for the GLA in this, perhaps trying to get some standardisation across London? Who wants to go?
Yeah, I can start with that. So, in terms of what you touched about, the use of parks and open spaces for all the uses and commercialisation and events, I think that's only one element of the usage that potentially parks and open spaces can generate income with. And Parks for London has done already quite a lot of work with councils in terms of looking at the pros and cons of events and trying to work with borough councils to help finding a balance, if you like. And there is always a balance in terms of, is the space suitable for that type of event? and how then do we work with communities to make sure that that event also adds value to the communities, because that could be also seen as an opportunity, if you like. It's often seen as a pain for the people living around it, but actually if we then turn around the event to make sure that that becomes something that can generate some added bonus for the communities living around, that becomes more partnership working, and that's something that we're trying to balance as local authorities. You know, trying to use these events not just as a kind of revenue generation element, but also trying to use it as a kind of catalyst to then improve the parks and spaces, which it could be a monetary value. It could be that as part of that event, income goes back and reinvested into the park, but it could also be some initiatives that the event organisers agrees with the community, like I don't know, working together with the police to do some kind of activities around that also reinforce the safety aspects of the events and the park. But I just want to stress that events is only kind of a tiny part of that. And you mentioned, you know, we are strapped for cash. What do we do about it? And there are loads of other initiatives and areas that councils are very creatively looking at, including Section 106 and SIL, for example. I mean, from Hounslow point of view, my budget for parks and open spaces is about £3 million, but SIL gives me about a £4 million programme with which I can then improve parks and open spaces. And similarly, I know other boroughs are tapping into SIL and Section 106 to do exactly that, which obviously also becomes a little balance in relation to development and what's coming out of that, then to go back into parks and open spaces. Then we talked about all the revenue opportunities in terms of fees and charges, so that's another element that we're looking into that. And again, Parks for London is looking at working with local boroughs in terms of licences. Businesses are using parks and open spaces, like including personal trainers or professional dog walkers, and there's more and more the use of this as an opportunity to actually work together with businesses and actually reinvest in the park. Leases, licenses, all of that, and also bonds as well. So again, looking at developments, some of that development, Section 106 is then reinvested in bonds and financial opportunities. So there are loads of models out there that we're using to generate income back into the park. But the key message is that every single opportunity is looked at locally and how we can improve the communities around that park and maximise opportunity for that park to work for those communities. So that's really important, and not seen just like a cash generation exercise.
Okay. So anybody else wants to come on that?
I'll just add, in addition, if you're looking at the events piece, as Stefania mentioned, Parks for London did this best practice guides with London councils in terms of what's the right event for the right sort of space sort of thing, so that exists. Yeah. But and Tom mentioned earlier, obviously the Mayor has established the London Green Spaces Commission, and this is a critical issue in terms of looking at those opportunities and for alternative governance models and or income streams that can be brought in to support, and we're working closely with the boroughs in terms of coming up with those solutions, and that'll be reporting over this winter. So that issue is currently live with the Commission.
Finally, I wanted to add as well the importance of Friends of Parks in terms of, working together with local authority to generate income and reinvest in the park. I mean, they are absolutely priceless in terms of the efforts they're doing, and they add value as well in terms of small community initiatives with crowdfunding and other initiatives that actually can benefit the parks in that way.
Can I just say that it depends whether or not the user group actually supports the idea of the venue, because you take, for example, London Fields user group, they object continually to the use of London Fields as a cash cow for the local authority. But they get very short shrift from the local authority, which carries on hiring it out, carries on burning the grass, and restricting access to local residents. So that's an assumption that, user groups want to generate income. No. Sometimes they don't.
No, but not with events. What I'm saying is that I think it's working together with friends groups is essential, particularly with events as well, you know, and understanding that actually we need to do this in partnership rather than, you're absolutely right, there's no point of having two sets of people who wants the same thing for the park, but having, you know, not working together.
I think the point is that friends groups can actually access funds that other
exactly.
groups the local authority can't access, including significant sort of trust and foundation fundraising for major improvements. So I think I think that's the point that's trying to be made. I just wanted to make a tangential point, really. Sorry, just you mentioned noise again. I think that our concerns about the noise impacts affecting parks are less to do with commercial events, which obviously there are significant noise impacts, but they tend to be quite confined in time, in a time sense. But our concern is the ongoing noise impacts, largely related to traffic, but also aviation noise that affect far too many London parks. So that's the work we did a few years ago when we took DEFRA noise mapping data gathered under the European Noise Directive requirements and mapped and assessed how many parks were affected by either severely or not so severely by noise. And you know, the figure that we came up with, which I quoted earlier, was that a third of London's parks are severely impacted by traffic noise. Is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of focus on air pollution, quite rightly, in recent years, and the effect that has on health. But noise pollution is recognised by the World Health Organization as having almost as significant an effect on human health, and I know Tom referred to noise in his opening remarks as well. There is new noise data available that DEFRA have produced a few months ago that we want to look at that to see how the situation has changed since the data was gathered, I think 4 or so years ago, to see whether or not there's been any improvement. But we are very supportive of any measures that local authorities can take or that the GLA can support to minimise and reduce the impact of traffic noise and aircraft noise on London's parks, so that they actually have a greater benefit for the health of local communities. And we want to work with partners to demonstrate how that can be achieved through relatively simple things sometimes, like creating hedgerows along road and park boundaries, landscape improvements generally, as well as creating, if you like, quiet area refuges within park areas. You know, we would like to see, for example, every London borough adopt the ability to legally create quiet areas within parks in order for them to provide a bit of a refuge from urban noise on an ongoing basis. I know that some authorities do this in an ad hoc way. I'm conscious of, I think, Paddington Square Gardens having a quiet area, but it would be great, wouldn't it, if every local authority were to commit to create, half a dozen quiet areas in their existing green spaces as a way of trying to draw attention to the importance of being able to access relatively tranquil environments within a busy urban setting.
I think just going back to the point on events briefly, I think one of the things that is really helpful is from a community perspective, and in terms of making that important balance between when spaces are being used for alternative activity and that point around income generation, is a real sense that the income that's being generated is being reinvested in that space. And I think that that's one of the concerns that we hear a lot, is that actually the local residents and the local community are going to feel much more comfortable with the idea, and Finsbury Park is a brilliant example because it's just so massive and it takes over so much of the space and for such a long period of time. But I think if there is a sense that income is what's actually keeping all the rest of those facilities running for the rest of the year, then people can be quite pragmatic about that sort of approach and understand the pressures that the authorities are under. I think a lot of the concern comes, and a lot of the frustration comes particularly from within parks and green space service managers, when there is a lot of activity and effort put into income generating activities, and there isn't the ability to ring fence the income that is generated, and you kind of see that plug in deficits elsewhere within the authority picture. And I think that's a struggle on every level. I also think that there is just that need for the burden of the funding of local of parks and green spaces not to sit so squarely with the local authority, whilst they are absolutely best placed to manage and continue to deliver these services. And that was absolutely the recommendation from the select inquiry, and that's the work that we're taking forward with the Parks Action Group. So there are other models being investigated through Future Parks Accelerator has been referred to, and we know that some of that is around how you bring more volunteer activity in. But at the core of it, in 97% of cases, it's going to be best run by the local authority. But we are talking continuously about where the benefits lie from creating these good quality parks and green spaces, and there needs to be a more joined up way of accessing other funding to make contributions to that pot of that's required to maintain those parks and green spaces. It does just fall very squarely in this in this particular area of a local authority's budget, but is creating this kind of cascade effect of benefits elsewhere. And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping in terms of guidance that comes out of the Parks Action Group will help to support that.
The GLA, do you have any strategic plan to do exactly what Neil's asked for about not necessarily quiet spaces in parks? That sounds like a very good idea, but just surrounding traffic to make the area around parks just a lot calmer.
I mean, I think the direction of travel is to significantly reduce cars and traffic noise. So I think over time that will begin to happen anyway. But also clearly with the investment in cycle routes and walking routes, a lot of those are close to or adjacent to parks, and that can be an opportunity to reduce the impact of traffic on some parts. But as Neil said, some of the simple measures are actually just planting. So it's partly about the way local authorities or other landowners think about the way they design and manage their space, and there are some quite simple solutions. But I think overall it's the gradual reduction in traffic which is the direction of travel, not just for air pollution but also for noise overall. And it's something which I think goes back to the sort of point around a greener public realm. All cities now are trying to significantly remove traffic from their cities, and that actually liberates quite a lot of space to become public realm, which has all those additional benefits in terms of not only climate resilience but public health too. And it's I think we're probably at that tipping point now where there's going to be a significant reduction in traffic, and lots of colleagues I know, younger people, are just not buying cars in London because why would you?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. All our members done? Is there anything else you wish we'd asked and you haven't answered yet? Yeah. Okay.
Can I? If just a minute, I just wanted to refer to a short quote from the 1943 County of London Plan that was put together by one of our co-founders, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, who was responsible for quite a lot of green space creation in the kind of post-war reconstruction period in London, but more broadly as well. And he said in the County of London Plan, and I think it relates to some of the things we've just been talking about here, talking about the vital importance, not just for health, but also for environmental quality, of what he called a coordinated regional park system of open spaces in London. And I just quote, it's just a couple of lines. The space in which the space around and between buildings needs planning in relation to the larger open spaces in the area, so that there is an interpenetration of greenery from the parks into the residential areas, and it becomes possible for the town dweller to get from doorstep to open country through an easy flow of open space, from garden to park, park to parkway, from parkway to green wedge, and from green wedge to green belt. And I think this sort of just emphasises the importance of thinking about our green spaces as a connected network and as a kind of a holistic resource to improve the public health within London.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that summarises the importance of it, and certainly the Health Committee wanted to look at this very particularly because to look at the impact of green spaces as we are getting through urbanisation and also the impact on people's lives. So can I thank you, please, all for your contributions. If you feel there's something you wish you said to us, or you come across some other piece of evidence you want to place to the Health Committee, you're always welcome to write in to us, and we will certainly consider it. And finally, can I ask the committee to note the report and the subsequent discussion, and delegate authority to me as chair, in consultation with the deputy chairman, to agree any output from the discussions.
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the progress on its work programme and the topics agreed by the GLA Oversight Committee on the 16th of October 2019 for its meetings in November 2019 and January 2020? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for 22nd of January 2020 at 2 p.m. in the chamber here. And I consider there's no urgent business, therefore we're done. Thank you.